All right, so we're going to get started with our next session. So if you don't know, Entersekt is one of our FIDO certified members that I work with a lot and that works with banks a lot all over the world to implement FIDO. But for today's presentation, we're looking at a very unique kind of subset of banks, which is credit unions. And Entersekt has a number of credit unions that are now live with FIDO. And so to share the deployment journey and lessons learned, please help me welcome Mzukisi Rusi, who is the Vice President of Solutions at Entersekt.
Thank you. Thank you. You did so well. All right. Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you to Megan because she does a lot to learn new names, right? And her and I were having a conversation. It's like, you're going to get it right. And you did so well. Well done. All right. So as mentioned, so name is Mzukisi, but you can call me the first three letters, right, which is Mzu. So I'm the VP of Solutions, as Megan mentioned, for Entersekt. And I'm here actually to give you a view of the journey. We've been speaking about how do we get FIDO to get mass adoption, right? And how do we enable consumers to have a seamless experience? And we've had a number of live deployments in the past year, right? And we're just going to give you visibility of how it looks like. But before I get into that, I want to give a snapshot of the credit union space. In terms of, I don't want to belabor the point that obviously we know that the pandemic forced a lot of financial institutions to actually, advance the process of digital transformation. And one in particular for credit unions. As we know, the profile of a credit union is not the same as a big FI, right? Some of the larger financial institutions. So in terms of technology innovation, there are some challenges there. But from the consumer, on the member experience perspective, that's what they obviously love to do. That's what they specialize in. But during this pandemic shift, this digital shift, of course, consumers then were pushed towards digital channels. As you can see, there's various channels that a consumer can actually come in from, right? Whether it's a browser, or it's a mobile app, or a chat, channel, or a call center, right? Somehow we need to know who that consumer is and how to authenticate them. But the problem is that the legacy authentication mechanisms that exist, I think a lot of speakers actually emphasized the problems, the vulnerabilities. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but username and password still used quite widely globally, right? OTP, whether it's through SMS or email to deliver that OTP or access code, right? And then, of course, as the credit unions were listening to the consumers or the members who said we need more advanced authentication, that's when they shifted the focus to say, look, third-party applications like the authenticators that exist there that you can download from the App Store, you can link it to your profile. But the problem is that the consumer needs to go download a separate app, right, from their digital experience. So this is where, from our side, we said, So, and these authentication methods that we actually mentioned, passwords, as we, said, it's a problem, right? From a numbers perspective, I'm sure we've all seen this, that over 15 billion of compromised credentials globally. 5 billion of those are actually unique, no repeated, pairs. And of course, we've seen some of the larger, firms that have actually also suffered, some major breaches. Some of these actually also store the identities of consumers. Some of them actually are leveraged for authentication. So there's a problem there. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room, right? SMS. SMS as a channel for authentication. I mean, my chief strategy officer and co-founder of the company, Devil, the other day was reflecting and saying, at Mzu, can you believe actually that SMS OTP was actually first used over 20 years ago? This is before smartphones came into play. right? These were the feature phones, like, you know those old phones. You can deliver a message. It's used for text-based. And, but obviously, as we go along, we've got more advanced devices, but we still rely on these legacy authentication mechanisms. So as you can see, it's fraught with so many issues, like no protection against the man-in-the-middle attack. I think Roger was very quite eloquent in the way that he articulated the problems when it comes to using the SMS channel. Non-delivery, we're dealing with sensitive transactions. If I'm transferring money to Megan, right, and then I don't receive the OTP, what happens? I mean, my colleague just today, he flew in from another country, South Africa, and he was trying to buy something on Amazon. But the problem is that his mobile number doesn't work here. He didn't do roaming, so he couldn't receive the message, right? But what if this time that it's not available, a fraudster has already gotten a hold of his mobile number, done a SIM swap to get the actual access code for his profile, right? And of course, it's vulnerable to so many of these things that we know. Malware. There are apps that can redirect the message that's destined for a specific device. SS7 attacks, SIM swap, right? So these are some of the vulnerabilities that exist within the SMS channel. And from a monetary perspective, here in the US alone in 2021, 68 million was lost as a result of SMS. 13,300 in another market that we actually operate in of these SIM swap, fraudulent attacks. What that means is basically saying, I'll go to the store and I say, I'm Megan, I've lost my device, but I want to keep my mobile number. Give me a new SIM card. That's the SIM swap attack. Because now I'm going to receive her messages. And then, of course, I can take over her account. And then in Europe, we've also seen that £2,600 is the average cost of a SIM swap incident. So again, don't want to belabor the point, but this is what we have to deal with, leveraging a legacy solution in terms of authentication. So we said to the credit unions, we've heard you, but we've seen this movie before around the world, but we want to get your perspective. So can you let us know what are some of these challenges that you're dealing with? And then, of course, it becomes quite common, quite similar to what we've seen around the world, ATO, right? The ability, if you've used a SIM swap attack, then all of a sudden you can receive the messages in terms of authentication. Poor user experience. Now imagine you're doing a transaction on your digital profile, you go to another, you go to a payments transaction, different user experiences. You might not receive the SMS, during the payment transaction, but you might receive it on digital banking. Could not be delivered. And then, of course, training of these users to move away from these inconsistent authentication methods. And the barrier to entry, because remember in the beginning I mentioned that they were considering third-party applications. But again, that means that you, Mr. User, go and download an app, right? And then the user's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I've got already so many apps on my actual device. So we said, okay, cool. This is how we actually helped. And of course, the objective was to say we move away from the legacy platforms in terms of authentication that actually result in the poor user experience to more advanced authentication mechanisms. And this is where FIDO came in to shine for us, right? I think Sarah actually mentioned around how easy it is to deploy, right? This is answering the call from the users that say, we want it to be modern, because if I'm using my device to go and log on into a fintech app, it's a different experience to what my bank or my financial institution is offering me, right? So now we're bringing in some of those advanced authentication mechanisms. And then, of course, the need for this to be consistent regardless of the channel that I'm transacting in, regardless of the device that I'm coming in from, right? So this is what we actually started with. We said, okay, right, we understand that it's a complex ecosystem. We know every FI, of course, there's digital banking providers, there's core providers, call center providers, and all that stuff. So it can be quite a lengthy process to move away from traditional or legacy forms of authentication. So we said, you know what, let's start off with the forgotten channels, call center, in branch, right, as well as ITM, without actually requiring the credit union to do heavy integration. Again, this is where FIDO then enables us to actually still offer that advanced authentication mechanism. So this, as you can see, a consumer that's doing a transaction, this is an in-branch scenario. Let's say someone goes to the branch and pretends to be me, right? Then me as a user, either I receive that, that link through my email or through a text or to scan a QR. As soon as I scan that QR, then it gives me exactly the context that is associated with that transaction. It's going to ask me, hey, Mzu, are you at a branch? Or are you on a call with a call center agent from Credit Union X? This is actually one of the credit unions that we enabled, Forefront, right? Where they quickly switched to this form of authentication. As a user, I'm going to say, oh, yes, of course, it's me, or no, it's not me. Once I click, and that's where FIDO, that FIDO token that's actually registered on that specific device, then takes over the experience, and then we get, that feedback in the back end to say this was a successful authentication. But of course, then the need was to say, okay, cool, this is great for the other forgotten channels, right? How do we bring this into digital banking? How do we enable the same experience to say that that FIDO token that I registered when I was doing in-branch or I was doing call center, can it be leveraged through another channel? As soon as I log in, it says, hey, Mzu, just present your biometric. So this is what we're enabling for some of these credit unions, where you can now enable passwordless authentication. As soon as I log in, I'm presented to, with the option to actually present my biometric. And then, of course, I'm into my profile. So the other option was to say, okay, cool, some of these clients might not have devices, for example, a desktop. My desktop doesn't support FIDO, right? Maybe I'm using, an old laptop or an actual desktop, right? Display the QR code to the user. Once the user scans that QR code, and then they land exactly on the same website, right? That browser that shows this is my bank, right? This is the presence of my bank. This is what I'm doing at this moment in time. For example, it says I'm logging into my profile. Am I actually logging into my profile, or is it a fraudster that's trying to trick me into logging into my profile? And of course, the context is very key. That single page app allowed us to actually drive some experiences based on the interaction. If I'm doing a login, we'll say, are you logging in? If I'm doing a transfer, are you transferring money from so to that person, right? Or if I'm in a call center, like I mentioned. And then, of course, I think last year, the Chief Strategy Officer actually presented the first use case of a payment transaction, payment authentication leveraging FIDO. This is what we did last year in Europe, with one of the European issuers, where we enabled the ability to authenticate a 3D secure transaction using FIDO, right? This is where we're taking the journey, for these credit unions. So how did we get here, right? So in the first stage, we said we want to reduce the barrier to entry, both for the member or the consumer and for the credit union. So let's start with those channels that are forgotten, right? So we said call center, ITM, right? Now they're rolling that out, with their members to say, just register this. But the beauty about it is that when the user has registered this in that channel, as soon as we enable, which is actually, we've just launched, there's a press release that's coming with, a few digital banking providers where we've pre-integrated so that this experience for the same, credit unions, so that when the consumer wakes up tomorrow, they could actually say, oh, I'm logging in. I have the option to actually use my biometrics to log in. So online banking, transaction authentication, step up, showing the context of exactly what's happening to my profile. And of course, mobile banking. But then stage 3, this is where we're now enabling some of the advanced use cases to say, look, we're going to even protect the chat channel, right? We're going to protect the account-based P2P payments, even, of course, payments, as we mentioned. This is some of the initial feedback that we received from the credit unions. This is Forefront. Forefront, from a member staffing perspective, of course, that personal touch with the credit unions is exactly what they pride themselves in. So biometrics, to enable biometrics for consumers, it was, the feedback was to say it's a lower barrier to entry. There's no need now for the user to go download a third app, an additional companion app, right? Quick enrollment, I think Sarah mentioned that, to say it's quick for the user to actually just enroll this. And the beauty about it is that once you propagate it and you make sure that you enable this for other channels, it's there, right? No need to re-enroll. And then, of course, that cross-channel coverage. We started off with, the other channels, right? Call center, ITM, in branch, and now there was an ask to say, can you guys bring this to digital banking? And then, of course, the ease of deployment. This is another credit union through, this is through our partner. This is the member pass solution that was enabled by Entersekt that basically say the same feedback that we received here, the omni-channel consistency, cross-channel coverage, the same type of feedback that we're receiving from these different credit unions. So looking ahead, this is my last slide, and I think a lot of speakers actually spoke to this. The main thing here is to say FIDO is, and we all know, right, it's not a silver bullet, but it's such an important key, it's such an important tool in the tool set. And of course, it enables, it's part of the tool set to enable personalization. As you can see, I mentioned those channels that the users can actually come in, whatever the channel, or whatever the device the user chooses to use. But of course, giving the FI the ability to select the appropriate authentication mechanism, whether it's an active authentication to actually prove that the person that we enrolled is who they say they are, so we can authenticate. Let's use FIDO in this case, or let's use in-app authentication. Let's use the SMS channel if we need to, if the user doesn't want to use any of those. But we still query some risk signals around that, right? The silent attestation to say maybe let's not, if we gather signals, behavioral biometrics, analytics, right? How the user types, how the user moves the mouse, the geolocation, the device reputation. How is this still the same device and user profile that we've seen before, right? And then of course the device ID is the same device that we've seen before. So you put all these things together to enable seamless and consistent user experiences for users. So you can say, I'm going to go frictionless because everything checks out. That device, the way that that user moves their mouse, the geolocation, the IP address, device reputation, it looks good. Let me go frictionless. But to Sarah's point, if there's an issue, maybe step up using another authentication mechanism. So you can choose the experience that you want to enable for your clients. So this is where, this is the journey or the roadmap that we've put in front of the credit unions or any FI, as a matter of fact, that requires to transform their authentication mechanism. So yes, that's me. So yep, 6 minutes left.
Did we have any questions? Well, first of all, you didn't tell me about the first three-letter thing.
But you did well. You did well.
That was like a big quiz for me.
Hi. I really liked your last slide where you talked about that you leverage device information as well. So with FIDO, do you, what is the stack that you go with? Is FIDO authentication and then you look at device details, or you do look at device details and then you figure out whether to do FIDO authentication or not?
That's a good question. I think it depends as well on the preference of the FI, right? So let's say they say, look, we do want your behavioral solution. what we would do would collect the details around that interaction and the device. FIDO will be one of the tools that we step up to say, hey, this device we don't know, this user we don't know, this IP address we don't know. We just want to go to your preferred authentication mechanism. And then, of course, if there's a FIDO token there, that's when the user will say, yes, it's me, and then we finish that process from an authentication point of view.
Any other questions in the room? There's also a question in the app. So in terms of the channels that the customers are touching, what is the recommended approach for deployment through the channels? Mm-hmm. And like, what is what's the time period? And also, like, what is the learning curve on the part of the customer? I know one of the slides earlier says this is much easier than downloading an app, mm-hmm. which of course it is. But is there anything that you've learned in these deployments? And I'll add one other thing, because that was a lot. But is there anything different about the demographics of the folks that you see in the credit union in terms of like their customer base versus your other clients in financial services? Do you remember all the questions that I just asked you?
I'll try to address them all. I think, in terms of recommendation, as you saw, right, the conversation with credit unions was to say, we know there's a bit of a challenge at the digital banking side, right? Because the digital banking providers, rightly so, they have their own product roadmap, right? They could say, look, we'll slot you in 2 years, but there's an urgent need, right? So that's why we started off with those other channels. But at the same time, this solution does not require much change on the front end side, right? As you can see, the user gets a QR code or a link, they click on it, that link has already been branded, for example, from our side with the FI's branding, the logo and the text and everything. From a deployment perspective, we can activate, it can be activated within a day, right? But then, of course, there needs to be some work on the FI side to consume, so it could take a couple of weeks to essentially have this live. In terms of user demographic, that's a very, very interesting question, of course. You get different people. Some people actually say, I'm not going to switch on my biometrics, right? That's where, for example, you could opt for an app. In that case, maybe you could do further behavioral intelligence on that device that they're using. So I hope I addressed your question.
Yeah, I think what I was getting at was, are there typically like an older,
of course,
like a older generation that might not perhaps mm-hmm. even use a mobile app or want to use the biometrics? So you hit what I was getting at there. Yeah.
Yep, 100%.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you.